Welcome, friends of Brown China Summit. My name's Andrew. I'm a junior here at Brown studying political science.
My name is Julian. I'm a first year studying international and public affairs as well as economics.
Today's event is a discussion on China's innovations and reinvention going into the next decade. Our organization is one that believes strongly in the power of dialogue to foster understanding, and our hope is that all viewing and participating are able to create valuable insights.
We're extremely fortunate and excited about all three panelists speaking with us today. They come with a wealth of experience in economics, development, and politics, and much more.
First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dwight H. Perkins. Dr. Perkins is currently the Harold Hitchings Burbank Research Professor of Political Economy at Harvard University, where he has held various positions, including Chairman of the Department of Economics, Director of the Harvard Institute of International Development, and Director of the Harvard University Asia Center. Dr. Perkins has focused extensive authorship on economic history and development, especially concerning the East and Southeast Asia, and using his expertise, he has advised the governments of Korea, Malaysia, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea in their economic policy. He has also served as a consultant to the World Bank, Ford Foundation, and U.S. government.
Yes, and we also have Dr. Victor Shih, who is the Ho Mu Lam Chair in China and Pacific Relations at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. Prior to UCSD, he was a professor of political science at Northwestern University and former principal for the Carlyle Group in global market strategy. His extensive authorship includes Chinese banking policies, fiscal policies, and elite politics. His book, Factions and Finance in China, Elite Conflict and Inflation, was the first to delve into the links between elite politics and banking politics in China.
Mr. Arthur Kroeber is a partner and head of research at Gavicle, a Hong Kong-based economic research firm, and founder of its China-focused Gavicle Dragonomics Research Service. Before establishing Dragonomics in 2002, he spent 15 years as a financial and economic journalist in China and South Asia. He also serves as an adjunct professor of economics at the NYU Stern School of Business, a senior non-resident fellow of the Brookings Tsinghua Center in Beijing, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. For this event, we'd like to break it up into a moderated section, approximately 45 minutes, and then open it up to audience questions for the last 15 or so minutes.
Once again, we'd like to thank all three panelists. So we're going to start with the first question, which is an icebreaker. Over the course of its modern history, from Mao's Cultural Revolution to Deng Xiaoping's opening and reform, China has seen several critical pivots in economic and political model that have sometimes hindered and at other times helped the development of its country into the superpower it is today. These changes are felt at every level of Chinese society, from countryside to city center. With this panel, we hope to understand the Chinese model and discuss where it's headed. As our first question, I'd like to ask our speakers to consider China's economic and political model currently and what it could develop into in the future. Considering challenges such as China's aging population, housing market downturn, or COVID-19, are there any factors which you believe will be pivotal in determining China's course? Do you see a need for China to reinvent itself in any way? And we'll start with Dr. Perkins.
That's a big question. One's tempted to give a 40-minute lecture on it. I think there's a big change in the model that is currently governing China. If you look at the model that was in place once Deng Xiaoping was restored to power in 1978 and continued beyond his life and through 2012 in the 18th Party Congress, the basic approach, the model of the development was really whatever works to make China rich and powerful. And it was constant, and so basically there was a willingness to experiment, and a whole change, a lot of changes introduced. If they worked, they continued on. I could go on at length giving illustrations. There was open debate about whether you should have a dual price system or a single price system, and it was a quite open discussion throughout that period. Maybe not so much in the political area, where people basically insisted on the continuation of the Communist Party, but you had this very active and very successful development, which everybody, I'm sure, in the room is and online is familiar with. What you've had since, when Xi Jinping first came in, he mainly concentrated on dealing with corruption, which had the dual purpose of actually getting rid of the corruption that was threatening the future of the party, but it also made it possible to get rid of people that were opposed to what you were trying to do. But then he has essentially done two things that have fundamentally changed the model of China. The first is he made it very clear that the leading part of the economy was going to be the state sector. And even the private sector was going to have a much more active role for the party committee within the private enterprises. And furthermore, you had a very vigorous, in recent years, a very vigorous regulation campaign against some of the bigger companies and some of the more successful, notably Alibaba, where it was as much a matter of reining in the individual for political reasons. And so you've had this strong shift away from the private sector is good and let's let it go, to now it's the public sector is the state-owned enterprises are critical. The second thing is that Deng Xiaoping said, let's keep our increasing power and our prosperity sort of a light under the barrel. We won't be active in foreign policy. Xi Jinping is very active in foreign policy, and in a way that has then led to the reaction initially in the U.S. of the Trump administration, which was somewhat incoherent. They tried decoupling, and Trump had his own ideas, but then that led China itself to, in a sense, the dual circulation strategy, which says, well, we're going to continue foreign trade, we'll continue the market economy, et cetera, but we're going to try to have as much technology. We want to rely mainly on our own technology and not have to rely on foreign technologies and so on. So this shift, and there's no longer active debate in public on these issues, and that has fundamentally changed, and I think is a real problem going forward. Sorry about the length.
Oh, thank you so much. Dr. Shih, your thoughts on the present and future of the Chinese model?
I completely agree with what Dwight just said. Some of the other implications of this more centralized policymaking model is, as Dwight pointed out, a focus on additional focus on the production side and sort of technological innovation in a few sectors that are deemed by the Chinese government as promising. And then so we've seen repercussions of this, and I'm sure Art can elaborate on that even further when he remarks on this, that China was on the cusp of really breaking through on a number of online platforms and having them as being global players, if not globally dominant. So a lot of these online education companies, China had the kind of technology and the platforms down. Providing online education became a huge market in China. Some of those models could have been transplanted to other developing countries and potentially make these Chinese companies global powerhouses in these sectors. Then suddenly the Chinese government more or less shut them down. In terms of kind of e-finance, also I think I'm not an expert in Ant. Art probably is a bigger expert in this, but I think they were also gearing up to be global players, and I think Ant Finance could have been a globally influential, if not dominant company, and would have forced a lot of U.S.-based and European-based companies to really try to compete with Ant Finance again, because of very direct interventionist action from the Chinese government, most likely, the initiative, again, as Dwight pointed out, came from the very top. And finance is now in this kind of gray area. Maybe in the end it's still okay, but certainly things are a bit in limbo right now. Because of this kind of intervention from the Chinese government, a lot of sectors can't really develop. Consumption, time and again, because of financial repression, this is something that Mike Pettis and others have pointed out for years. Consumptions in China continue to lag behind. You continue to just have the upper middle class to the upper class in China being the main consumers. A lot of talk about how, when rural residents move to cities, they're going to become big consumers. That's not really panning out because their income is still relatively low. Inflation is higher than what's officially announced. And again, all of these are policy outcomes, the low birth rates that we're seeing. These are all policy outcomes. I mean, low birth rates, economic growth, I know there's a secular decline, but the fact that it's declined so much, so fast, I think is a kind of a policy outcome. And I think a more decentralized way of policymaking, either back to the Hu Jintao model of having, individual Politburo members being in charge of different policy area, or I would say, giving local governments even more fiscal autonomy and then empowering them to make their own policies is another way to go. In recent years, unfortunately, we've seen fiscal centralization as more and more localities in China, the revenue intake slowed down while the expenditure continues to go upward. So they have no choice but to be dependent on either fiscal transfers from the central government or permission from the central government for them to issue bonds. So across the board, policies is very centralized and not encouraging both private sector investment or kind of consumption.
Wonderful, thank you. Mr. Kroeber, you have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, basically, I agree with everything that Victor and Dwight have said. The way I would boil this down is, I think, if you look at the sort of the governance strategy of the Communist Party since the late 1970s when Deng Xiaoping took over, it's basically always tried to seek a balance between what you could call the control agenda, which is the desire of the Communist Party to retain a monopoly on the political system on the one hand, and the growth agenda, which, as Dwight pointed out, was very aggressive and very opportunistic and very flexible in its means. And the objective was to have maximum control over an economy that was growing as fast as possible, both in terms of just like the dollars and cents GDP, but also in terms of what they call comprehensive national power. And so I think what we all have a concern about is that China has been pretty successful at kind of balancing the imperatives of political control and economic growth over the past 40 years, with some ups and downs. But we now seem to have a movement towards a real emphasis on top-down control of everything. And whether it's through sort of the state-led development mentality that Dwight was pointing out, or the fiscal centralization that Victor was noting. And there's, I think, a real question about whether China is, losing sight of the sort of the basic things that made the economy work really well for the last 40 years, which was having a lot of flexibility, having a lot of kind of bottom-up vitality, whether through the private sector or local government initiative. So I would say that's a huge question mark looming over China's economic prospects over the next 10 to 20 years. I'll just throw in one additional sort of geeky way of thinking about this, and this is much more of a pure economics point than a political economy point, which is if you think an economy, basically, if you boil it down, economic growth is a combination to increases or improvements in the labor force, increases in capital, and increases in productivity, right? So it's basically those three things added together. And what China's had for much of the last 40 years is a workforce that was growing, an economy that could absorb a lot more capital inputs because they didn't have enough infrastructure or enough equipment or machinery or housing or whatever. And where this flexible approach to economic policy had delivered very high productivity growth. So China had these incredibly high growth rates because it was getting significant positive contributions from labor, from capital, and from productivity. And what you see now as you look ahead is the first two parts of this equation are looking very dodgy, right? So the population is probably going to peak in a few years. The working age population, I think, has already peaked and is starting to shrink. So unless you can massively improve the quality of the labor force, which is a tricky thing to do, your contribution from just the labor inputs is probably going to decline. They've built out the infrastructure of a modern industrial economy, so you can't generate a lot of growth simply by throwing more capital into the system. The property market has reached, I think, a permanent plateau where you can't just keep building more and more houses every year. That's going to have to stabilize and decrease. So two of the three factors that have been driving China's economic growth are kind of going into reverse on the labor and capital side. And so what that means is if you want to keep growing by, say, 4 or 5% a year, which would be a very good outcome for China's level of development, you need to get a lot of productivity growth. And I think that's where the big question mark is. And what we've highlighted here in all of our comments is that maybe the sort of obsession with top-down control is not ideal for productivity growth. I think some of the Chinese leadership would take the view that no, this is okay. We are a big country and we can just direct capital into high technology sectors of the future. And if enough of these bets pay off, then we'll have so much high tech that this will drive productivity growth. That seems to me the implicit bet of Chinese economic policy at the moment. But it's very much in tension, I would say, with this down. Some of its policy. Do you see these economic challenges as a threat to Xi's legitimacy or the CCP's legitimacy, which has often hindered on its ability to continue economic development? And I guess this is kind of an open question.
Who do you want to have go first?
Victor is the political scientist among us, so I think he should take it.
I'll be very quick, but then I actually have a question for Dwight, actually, after that. So I edited a book called Economic Shocks and Authoritarian Stability, where we looked at a number of cases around the world, not just the Chinese case, but also, Iraq. We looked at Russia, which, has had a whole series of economic shocks, including the current one, Iran. And what we found was that when there's economic hardship, for authoritarian regimes which have been in power for, a little while, they tend not to collapse, actually. They tend to survive. And the reason is because dictators are not stupid. During good times, they may have a kind of a coalition to support them that's bigger than is necessary. And so when there's economic hard times, he can reduce benefits going to members of his ruling coalition and still survive. And this is what we're seeing in Russia right now. All these oligarchs, the funding is getting cut off, et cetera, et cetera. They have no exit option. What are they going to do? It's like, okay, we can defect to the U.S. What are you going to get? A nice house in West Virginia and, $5,000 a month. That's not very attractive. If they remain supportive of Putin, maybe one day, the war war being resolved and everything, they can go back to being billionaires. So the exit option really is not that apparent. The same thing with the Chinese elite. What are people in the Chinese Communist Party at the end of the day going to do? There were people who were powerful enough to challenge his authority earlier on in his administration, but they're all gone now, retired or in jail. So, as he continue, and then in my forthcoming book, Coalitions of the Weak, sorry to flock my works here, it happens to be relevant to the discussion. Coalitions of the Weak, I argue that Mao was very successful in being a dictator for life. Although at that time, I have to say, China's economy was performing okay. And I think Xi Jinping can replicate the strategy of getting rid of powerful potential challengers and replacing them with very weak figures, and continue to be in power even if the economy is not doing so great. Of course, if there's a truly bad economic shock, then who knows, right? And the only shock that is big enough that I think would jeopardize his power is if there's an actual war between the U.S. and China, or even if there's a war on the Taiwan Straits. Short of that happening, I really think there's really no economic shock that's big enough to cause any serious concern on the political front. I don't know if people agree with that.
No, I would tend to agree with it. I think, in a sense, you can see the whole strategy of Xi Jinping at the moment is really he's more concerned with maintaining power than he is with the maintaining a really high growth rate. I think he probably feels rightly that he can survive perfectly well with a 3 or 4% growth rate. I don't think, whereas in the past the party was sort of relied for its support on the very high growth rate. That's clearly they're clearly moving away from that, and he's basically going halfway back toward Mao. I mean, Xi Jinping thought is now getting the kind of attention that Hu Jintao thought and Jiang Zemin thought certainly never received, and you're getting criticism of the party is cracked down on very hard. Major policies, including the COVID, zero COVID policies, are not subject to debate. I mean, there are some people in the streets get annoyed by it when they're in lockdown, but in terms of any public debate about it, there is none. Productivity is low. I mean, it's the growth rate of 9 or 10% was a catch-up growth rate. That's never going to happen again, no matter how well they manage the economy. But they can get along fine, 3-4%. The real question, I think, with Xi is whether it is in the foreign policy and the military security area, whether he pushes a little too hard and gets too big a reaction, and then something unravels. Right now, the most obvious case would be Taiwan, but and somehow would work into that. But it's pretty hard to speculate on what all that could be.
Wonderful, thank you. Mr. Kroeber, did you have any thoughts on this?
No, I pretty much concur with all of that. I will say, just a quick observation. I was back in China in November and December, and in the conversations I had with sort of people in the economic realm, there was a lot more discontent than there had been a year earlier with the quality of economic decision making, and there was a strong feeling among sort of the technocrats that there'd been too much political interference, and since then we've had, in addition to the domestic purely economic problems, we've had the mismanagement of the COVID response in Shanghai, and the rather interesting decision to align aggressively with Russia ahead of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think all of those things are are definitely sources for criticism of Xi by, people within elite circles. But I would tend to agree with both Dwight and Victor that although there's a lot of grumbling and discontent, none of that adds up to a political force that is strong enough to force a significant realignment in the the senior leadership.
Yeah, thank you so much. So now, if I may pivot to the world stage, the recent developments in Ukraine have shattered our notions of great power peace for our age. And although the world's attention is on Europe for the time being, the war and its ramifications may have huge consequences for U.S.-China relations and the Asia-Pacific generally. Would you mind sharing your view on Chinese foreign policy during this global moment of crisis? And what does the current situation mean for possibilities of conflict in Asia? Mr. Kroeber, if you'd like to start.
Sure. I mean, I think my analysis of this is that, so basically what happened was that Vladimir Putin came out to Beijing ahead of the Winter Olympics for the opening ceremony. And he, at the end of his visit there, which I think was his 38th personal meeting with Xi Jinping since Xi took power. So the two leaders, Xi has met Putin more than he's met any other individual global leader. At the end of that meeting, they issued a joint statement, which was very florid in its language, and it talked about this limitless partnership between China and Russia. And some of that, I think, was just rhetoric. But I think it also did signal very clearly that Xi has kind of placed a bet on a relationship, pretty close relationship with Russia. And this did not come out of the blue. There's been, I think, a steady trickle of things that the two countries have been doing over the last several years to, resolve some of their longstanding differences, or at least push them to the side and present a united view. And I think the underlying assumption of Xi's bet on why it's good for China to align itself with Russia is, number one, he and his colleagues have come to the conclusion that the U.S. is just now implacably hostile to China and wants to contain it at all costs. So the U.S. is now basically an adversary. And then number two, I think there's a belief among many Chinese leaders that the U.S. is in long-term decline. So the U.S. is hostile and they're very powerful, and that's a problem, but they're also in decline. And so therefore, it makes sense for China to align itself with Russia, which also is not happy with U.S. leadership of the global order. And so together, they have more of an ability to erode this global order and create more space for China and Russia. And I don't think, the impression that I've gotten from, all the people I've talked to is that the Chinese did not know, Putin did not reveal to them his full plans for invading Ukraine. So it was not like they were signing on to that invasion. And I think they kind of got blindsided by that. But I don't see any evidence that this is causing them to recalibrate or pull away from the alignment with Russia. It's too firmly based. And I would be curious about, certainly about Dwight's views on this. My view is that in the long run, this is, in the short run, they're probably going to be able to thread the needle of, on the one hand, sort of aligning with Russia and being very tepid in their, public statements about the invasion of Ukraine, but on the other hand, not doing enough to directly support Russia that they would then be subject to sanctions by the U.S. or Europe. So they're going to try and walk that tightrope. My bet is that they can probably get away with that. But if you look from a long-term strategic perspective, it is hard to see this as anything other than a big mistake by China. Its economic relationship with Russia is actually not that large. It's very narrow. It's based on resources. Russia has a GDP the size of New York State. It's not actually a global economic power in a broad sense, although very powerful in a resource sense. China depends a lot on its engagement with the rest of the world through trade and investment and so forth. And they've put themselves in a situation where they've yoked themselves to a really declining and not very stable power, and created more difficulties in enabling them to further their engagement with the bigger and more vibrant parts of the global economy. So I think over time, I don't think that China is going to face a very high cost this initially, but I think over a 5 to 10 year period, this will probably come to be seen as a pretty major error of judgment on Xi Jinping's part.
Thank you. Dr. Perkins, your thought on the current situation or tensions in East Asia?
I just, following on Arthur, I agree with everything he said. I think that, if China were to actively support Russia in this and try to get around the sanctions, it would obviously lead to major retaliation by the U.S. and the EU, and it would worsen relationships in a hurry, and it would cause lots of problems for China. So I think they're going to, as Arthur said, thread the needle, and I think they're going to get away with it. I think they're also, Putin is clearly not demonstrating that he is as powerful and as I think a lot of people thought he was, and that the Russian army, conventional army, it may well in the end, defeat Ukraine, but it has clearly not performed very well to date. So it's not a very strong conventional military force. I think the most interesting thing about it is that, in some ways, Putin looks on Ukraine the way China looks on Taiwan. As for Putin's point of view, Ukraine was always part of Russia. It was part of Imperial Russia. It was part of the Soviet Union. He sees it's not a legitimate separate country, and therefore he's trying to recreate this Soviet. It's not identical to the Chinese situation, since there's agreement, or there was agreement at least on both sides of the Taiwan Strait, that there was one China, and the U.S. policy is that there's one China. But nevertheless, there are a lot of similarities, and also, and the way the West has responded in the Ukraine case, the question for China would be, how would the West respond in a Taiwan attack? As I suspect they're looking very hard at what's happening and trying to figure out how that affects their own decision making going forward.
Yeah, thanks. Dr. Shih, just to follow up on that, if conflict did arise in East Asia or just the tensions in Ukraine, how do you see that the consequences for East Asia and for China?
Yeah, just very quickly, of course, I agree with what Art and Dwight have said. An additional, not really an additional, but focusing on one aspect of this relationship between China and Russia. I think Russia instinctively knows, Putin himself instinctively knows that even beyond this kind of good personal relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping, China really cannot afford to have an uncertain leadership in Russia, because Russia of course shares this 1,000-mile long border or 2,000-mile long border with Russia, and so if Russia were to God forbid democratize or something like that, that really would not be a good situation for China, and this creates some kind of moral hazard situation where Putin apparently can make bigger military gambles than is probably optimal for Russia, knowing that kind of at least financially China is going to come to its aid. Indeed, there are some signs of that. Late last year, there was a huge transfer of a part of Russia's foreign exchange reserve to China for safekeep. So there was some anticipation of freezing of foreign exchange assets even then. This was according to this Foreign Affairs article or something that I read. And then, but now the situation is interesting, right? So now the problem is on the battlefield. It's no longer a money issue. Money, as it turns out, did not become such a huge problem for Russia because the way to really crash an economy financially is by having huge outflows. But what Russia has stopped, and what the SWIFT ban, by the way, has helped the Russian government in a sense because Russians can't spend money overseas anymore. So on the trade side, on services side, there's no outflows. And while people are still buying energy from Russia, then it creates like this huge net inflows, which is why the ruble is just as strong as it was previously. So financially, it's not a problem anymore, but the problem is now on the battlefield. The troops they're not running out, but they're being depleted at a very fast rate. Weapon systems are being depleted at a very fast rate. What if, Putin says, look, I'm about to lose power here because I've lost so much of our military with very little to gain. Someone within my regime is going to take me out. Xi Jinping, you have to send volunteer forces to Russia to help us. What would China do in that situation? Rationally, of course, I agree with Dwight and Art that China would not intervene in any way. But on the other hand, it is kind of a credible threat for China, right? So if there's political uncertainty in Russia, that would create a very unfavorable situation for China. So I think, the situation is evolving. I guess we'll see.
Thank you. Yeah, and just as a quick follow-up, so if the unfortunate situation did arise and there were a conflict in the Taiwan Strait or in East Asia, where would you see the rest of the world reacting? Would you see international reaction similar to that of Ukraine with sanctions and UN votes, or would you see military action from outside of the East Asia sphere as a possibility? And anyone can strike at this question if they have thoughts.
Well, I'll take a first crack. So my understanding is that the assumption of Chinese military planners is that the U.S. would militarily come to Taiwan's aid in the event of a Chinese action there. I mean, U.S. policy is deliberately ambiguous on that point, but Chinese military planners, I believe, assume that the U.S. would intervene militarily. Certainly, there's, I think, a much lower bar to U.S. military intervention in Taiwan than there would be with Ukraine. But I think one of the reasons that there is that lower bar is that there's less of a sense of China as a serious nuclear threat, and the Chinese are trying to change that as quickly as possible by building up their nuclear arsenal. So I think that's still, that there's probably a higher likelihood of the U.S. actually getting militarily engaged over Taiwan, but there's still some uncertainty around that. I think the more interesting uncertainty, though, is, what would be the reaction of the world in terms of economic sanctions, right? So if you look at the Russia sanctions, basically the U.S. has been very successful in enlisting its treaty allies to engage in sanctions against Russia. So this would include most of the European Union, Japan, Singapore, and Australia. It basically has not succeeded in getting anyone who is not a treaty ally to join into sanctions, so including major countries like India, with which it's had increasingly close relations, Brazil, most of the developing world. I think that is an interesting question. It's hard to answer. If China did something related to Taiwan, you would probably get strong economic sanctions, certainly from the US, almost certainly from the European Union. But then once you get into the rest of the developing world, I think it becomes much more questionable, in part because the economic stakes that all of these countries have in China are much, much larger even than they have with Russia. It's also possible that the Europeans might take the view that while the Russia invasion of Ukraine in some sense is an existential threat, to the post-war European order, China invading Taiwan maybe is just more remote and they don't care as much. So I think there is a high degree of uncertainty about what kind of international solidarity you would have in either military action or in economic action if China chose to move on Taiwan. And as Dwight said, I think the Chinese are looking at this very carefully. I think they will have been probably surprised by the solidarity that has been achieved vis-a-vis Ukraine, right? I think the sanctions effort there has been much, much stronger and more widespread than anyone could have predicted previously. And we may get to a point where there's actually material blockage of Russian exports of oil and natural gas, which we are not up to yet, but we could get that. And so I think if you're a Chinese leader, you're looking at that and you are probably surprised, not in a happy way, about the strength of that response, and assuming that some variant of that would probably come to bear in Taiwan. But it's very hard to come to I think clear judgments on that, at least for me.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, Art, I have to say one thing here, right? So if there is war across the straits, the world economy is in deep, deep, deep trouble because of TSMC. There is no way TSMC can survive without being destroyed. Even if Taiwan were to win, so to speak, it's history. And then all of a sudden you have 50% of semiconductor fabrication in the world being taken offline. It doesn't just affect companies like NVIDIA and Apple. It affects all of the upstream software services, basically trillions and trillions of dollars of market capitalization we've built up in the past 10 years based on software services. The growth of that is going to go to zero, if not decline. It's going to have tens of trillions of dollars.
I totally agree with that. I mean, the direct impact of that would be much larger, which I think is one reason why China would be pretty reluctant to make that move, because they would also incur gigantic economic costs as a result of that. So you have two questions. One is what would be the military and economic response, right? But also what would just be the impact? And I agree that if China were to invade Taiwan, say in the next 5 years, the impact on the global economy would be catastrophic. I mean, we'd be talking about a major global
and that impact
recession
would be
or
bigger
depression.
than most of the economic sanctions that we could possibly throw at China.
Right. That is true.
Because if TSMC gets blown up, all the software services in China also goes down the toilet.
Correct.
Well, TSMC is an illustration of the broader, because people are criticizing us because we promoted closer economic relations and getting China involved in the international community, and it's been so successful in expanding its trade, and that. But the other side of that is that has also meant that China is much more vulnerable. But then the rest of the world is very vulnerable if China goes down too, because we're all so fully integrated, and that's a pretty good argument for not going to war. TSMC, aren't they? I think they are building a plant in the U.S. now, aren't they, to expand into the in order to be able to not be quite as vulnerable. So on the economic side, there is this huge interaction, and there are a lot of countries. I agree with Arthur. There are a lot of countries, Southeast Asia and Latin America and Africa, that are certainly not going to be at all interested in sanctions of one sort or another. On the military side, I think the issue comes down to something very similar to what has happened in Ukraine. A military takeover of Taiwan is much more difficult because of the Taiwan Straits. You have to get across 100 miles of water. That said, the real question is how hard would Taiwan fight? If Taiwan was basically turned out to be as determined to maintain its separation from the mainland as Ukraine has proved to be. That would then lead to a very large-scale U.S. support in terms of support of the Taiwan effort. When you get into an actual direct military confrontation between the United States and China, however, as Arthur pointed out, China may not now be as big a threat in nuclear as Russia is, but it's getting there, and has made it very clear they're going to go there, and when the U.S. is, my understanding is when the U.S. has run war games, where they have one side representing the U.S. working with Taiwan and the other side the mainland, China, the PRC usually wins. Now that's the PRC as being run by U.S. senior military people, so we can't, for example, put the days when we could have our carriers sail through the Taiwan Straits and not be threatened. Those are long gone. You saw what happened to that Russian cruiser from Ukraine. There's no way the U.S. has the conventional power that would make it easy to defend Taiwan the way it would have been true, say, 20 or 30 years ago. So there's a military component to what would happen, and there's then this big economic component. And it's a big question mark.
Thank you. It's been a wonderful discussion. I think we'd like to open the floor now to audience questions. If you wouldn't mind just saying your name, if you would like to address the question to a specific speaker. And this room is fitted with microphones, so all you got to do is speak up. And if no one has any questions, I have a few myself. So,
Do we have any questions here?
I just had a quick question. We touched on this a little bit earlier. China is facing a big demographic problem, and I think the demographic problem, a shrinking population size, has ramifications in many arenas. Some of you even said in the case of Russia, Putin might see the decline in the population in Russia. This might be his final opportunity to, attempt to exercise military power over Ukraine. Do you see the demographic problem in China as maybe like a catalyst for aggressive action in one arena? And I was wondering, do you see the government addressing the demographic problem anyway? I know also, Mr. Kroeber, you mentioned earlier, there's different factors of development or growth, and one of them is productivity. And when you have a declining population, you want to see increases in productivity. But recently, there's been a lot of discussion about China's disparities between, in education in rural and urban areas, which have also posed, a threat to China's ability to continue to increase its productivity. So I guess it's kind of a two-pronged. If anyone sees any effect, the demographic effect on the military aspect, and then if the demographic effect on a more economic aspect.
Well, I can start with that. I think the issue of aging is an issue further down the road. I don't think it's as serious as some people have suggested over the next decade. You can solve the problem in terms of the labor force fairly easily by simply increasing the retirement age. The retirement age in China is very low. The health of the population is, on the whole, quite high and not that different from the U.S. And so raising the retirement age would give you a substantial increase in the labor force available to you. Furthermore, in terms of the skilled labor force, that's also steadily increasing. And it's increasing also at a rapid pace. I think the bigger and the more serious demographic issue is that there are huge numbers of young people that were left back in the countryside and not very well educated. And as you get up to a higher per capita income what the industry and the economy needs is highly skilled people, you have a couple of 100 million people who are not going to be well enough educated for a modern economy going forward. And the number of unskilled jobs that will be available a decade and 2 decades from now are not going to be sufficient to keep those people well employed. It's not unlike some of the problems the U.S. has in that regard, but the numbers are much larger. They won't stop growth. I think they can continue to grow, but you have a major social problem with a lot of people who aren't really sufficiently educated to be part of a modern economy.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, just very quickly. So we had a couple of talks last Friday that was really interesting, especially a paper by Qi Dongtao, who's at National University of Singapore, where he did a 10-city survey back in 2019 on people's support of an armed reunification with Taiwan. And very interestingly, what he finds is that the people who are more educated, members, of course, and people who work for either an SOE or the Chinese government are more supportive of an armed reunification with Taiwan. So that's kind of intuitive. But then interestingly, that means that the less educated people who don't work for SOEs, are less supportive of an armed reunification in Taiwan. My interpretation, and this is not his interpretation of data, but my interpretation of data is that this is a very rational thing, that the people who are most likely to become soldiers, in the front line are not your Tsinghua and Beida graduate, but instead they are people with, junior high or high school education from the countryside who are going to have to serve on the front line and be part of the invasion force. Intuitively, these people know that this is not a good thing for them, and therefore they're less supportive of an armed resolution to the cross-straits issue. So over time, of course, this is an issue, right? So not only is the share, the proportion of young population is shrinking very rapidly in China, even among young people in China, of course, because of this focus on education and economic growth, many of them try to become college students. Many of them, now I think is it a majority, a close to majority of people who are turning 18 are going into universities of some sort. They are not going to want to be in the front line and fight. The people who are very nationalists, they know that they don't have to fight in the front line under the current system. So we'll see how much support there is for an armed reunification if the Chinese government were to institute some kind of conscription system which included college students or college graduates. I think that would be a pretty interesting test.
Thank you. That's been very interesting. Mr. Kroeber, do you have anything to add?
Nope, I don't. Thanks.
Wonderful, thanks.
It looks like we have an audience question.
First of all, thank you for attending this event. I've learned so much from this panel. I have a question specifically on the semiconductors, and it ties into the last discussion we had before the questions were opened up for the floor with regards to semiconductors and the economic impacts of a possible Chinese invasion on Taiwan. I was wondering whether or not, given that manufacturing represents an area in which China has historically increased its productivity and growth, whether or not the potential ramifications to the market from decreased semiconductor manufacturing from a possible invasion of Taiwan could represent an opportunity for China, in that if Taiwan represents a core strategic interest for the country, then it can move its economic prospects right now in the present towards increased semiconductor production, or trying to invest in other manufacturing centers for semiconductors as a means of sort of remedying this possible effect of a possible invasion and making an invasion more likely in its
Yeah. So let me kick off on that one. So first of all, I think I think in this discussion about Taiwan, there's kind of been an embedded premise that I would challenge, namely that sort of Plan A for China is a military reunification. I'm not sure that there's really evidence for that. I mean, it's very clear that the objective is reunification, but I think the notion that there is some kind of imminent desire by the Chinese government to force the issue, I don't think that there's really much evidence to support that. This is just to say that, I think when we talk about Taiwan invasion scenarios, we're talking about extreme hypotheticals that are not actually part of any sort of core scenario for the next several years. However, the semiconductor link, right now, China has been investing for 20 years very heavily in semiconductor production. They have very little to show for this, actually. They have a couple of semiconductor companies that are foundries that do similar things to what TSMC does. They remain several generations behind. The biggest one, SMIC, is now subject potentially to U.S. sanctions that would prevent them from obtaining the equipment necessary to upgrade and catch up. And this is actually very striking when you compare the progress that's been made by some of the Korean semiconductor firms, namely Samsung, that has climbed up the technology ladder much faster than the Chinese competitors. So yes, it is true that China right now is investing heavily in the semiconductor industry. And one of the key reasons for this is that as a result of the trade war with Trump, et cetera, and various U.S. sanctions, they become very aware that they are heavily dependent on technology that is ultimately sourced from the U.S. or from U.S. allies. And so they have a self-reliance agenda, and a lot of this is around building up domestic semiconductor capacity. I think the problem is that semiconductors are very complicated technology. You can't just invest a lot of money and achieve success. And it is a very sort of globally interdependent industry. So the notion that China, or frankly any other country in the world, can become fully self-sufficient in the entire semiconductor chain, that's just a complete fantasy. That's not how it works. So they can increase their level of self-reliance. I would be frankly amazed if they were able to increase their degree of self-reliance within the next decade to the degree that they would no longer have to care about TSMC's facilities getting blown up, if in an invasion of Taiwan. I just don't think that it's practical for them to do that. So yes, they are investing heavily in semiconductors as part of self-reliance strategy. Yes, they will probably increase their capacity to manufacture, various kinds of chips for, many purposes. But it is the ability to completely wean themselves off of reliance on either chips or the tools for making chips that are internationally sourced. I just don't think that that's a realistic objective on any kind of, forecastable time frame.
Just to agree on your first remarks, Arthur, on Taiwan, there's no prospect in the next 5, probably 10 years of any kind of major military action. If there were a military action, it would be something designed to make trade difficult. I mean, it would be something that would raise insurance rates for anyone who tried to send traders into to Taiwan. It wouldn't be an outright invasion of a force of some sort of that sort of. And then if you go into, we go into these strategic things like the high tech end of semiconductors, you also have, of course, these rare metals that play a critical role in a lot of our high technology. And when you you talk to American people who are involved with the military side and so on, and the rare metals. There are plenty of these metals elsewhere in the world, but at the moment, China has most of them. And the question is whether the U.S. is now making some effort to get development of these metals elsewhere, so that we're not as dependent on China. But again, it's not clear how China would go about trying to restrict access to those metals.
Right. Thank you. Well, it looks like we are approaching the end of this webinar. Dr. Shih, just for purposes of fairness, if you'd like to make any final comments or remarks.
Oh, no. I think Art and Dwight summarized this issue very well, and I agree with them.
All right, we'd like to thank you guys for coming out to speak with us. It's been an amazing and interesting discussion, and we'd like to thank everybody here. That concludes this portion of Brown China Summit. Thank you.
So, Dr. Perkins, Mr. Kroeber, Dr. Shih, thank you so much for coming.